Welcome everyone to this Wave Lunchbox webinar where we start to look at the concept of gender intersectional practice in adult and vocational education. My name is Kit McMahon. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the national co-convener of Wave. In my day job, I'm also CEO of a women's health service in Melbourne, Women's Health in the Southeast as well. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are all coming from unceded lands of First Nations people. I'm on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land today, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. I recently reconnected and relearned that in these lands, in the lands of Naarm, this season is known as Wombat season. Our First Nations people across the land have deeper knowledge of country and deeper knowledge of weather. And this season goes from April to June. Just a reminder, folks, that how we work, give yourself the space to be present if you can. I know it's very hard. I'm the first one to say that can be very hard. But if you find anything that's is confronting, please feel free to step away. We will be exploring concepts of gender and gender inequity in this session, but just understand that people can have different opinions about that, and we're all learning. We're all on that learning journey. Feel free, if you'd like to raise your hand at any point if you'd like to make a comment. This is not a webinar, it's in the meeting function of Zoom, but also feel free to use the chat function if you'd like to make a comment as it's going on. We're going to end this webinar around 1:30 or a bit earlier if we can. I'm into giving people a gift of time if I can. But just give yourself the space, if you can, to be virtually present and act with curiosity as we move forward. Just a reminder about who Wave is and our mission. Look, our mission is to advocate so that Australian VET in particular and adult education systems are equitable for all women and girls with all their intersectional barriers that they face. And our vision is about realising our mission, I guess, where we actually have a future where women and girls can participate fully in all aspects of work and democratic society because of what we call equitable and transformative vocational adult education. And in this webinar today, you'll probably hear that word transformative used a couple of times. Wave likes to work in keeping with that mission and that vision and the kind of the content areas that we speak to. We are a feminist organisation and we work within a feminist framework. And again, you might hear a little bit about what that means today. But in keeping of that, we're committed to centre the lived experience in our work and also seek to do that as a way of actually creating inclusivity and relevance. We actually believe, and I know many on this line do today, that education is transformative. But I guess we're saying it can only be transformative if equity is centred in that work. And like all good organisations, but also in keeping with our mission and our core areas, we always work in partnership and collaboration because it's not going to be one person or one thing that fixes this world. So today's webinar, we're going to sort of ask if there's a role for gender analysis in pedagogy. Tip, we think there is. And we're actually going to look briefly at the evidence around that. Now, after the webinar today, those that registered will get an email from us with a link to the recording, but also a bit of an overview of what that evidence is and what the research we're pulling upon is. And we'll also then look forward to see what the implications for Australian VET and the skills system is moving forward. So how will this flow? Well, we're going to look at the big picture first. What's gender got to do with it? We'll take a little dip into principles and theory, but then we'll look to the application and where to next. Of course, as I said, if you've got any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat box and absolutely I'll see them. So, to rephrase the great Tina Turner, what has gender got to do with it? Well, if you look around the federal sphere at the moment, if you look around what's being talked about. And for those that were at the last or our first webinar, you'll recognise these. There's quite a bit of policy and strategic plan statements coming from our government about the fact that it has got a bit to do with it from a bigger picture. So this is the WEET plan, the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, and their recommendation 3 names the role that what they call lifelong, accessible, flexible and affordable education and skill building has to actually create economic equity. And this idea of deliberately identifying and removing disincentives for addressing the sustained pay gap. The principles that underpin this current National Skills Agreement, Principle 3, actually names a number of people in our community that face intersecting barriers to thriving, that actually we need to do something whereby these people and the barriers that they face need to be addressed. So they actually have access to education training, and again, the naming of the role of that education platform, which is this idea of well-paid, secure jobs. So it's not only about the education that we're trying to do, but it's about actually understanding that it sits within a context of achieving a bigger outcome, which is people's lives, people having quality of lives, and one of those live components is quality work. JSA's own roadmap from 23, recognising they're going to have another one out soon, actually names that we need to better understand what those barriers are and the gendered outcomes in the work. And I was quite invigorated, I guess, to see this naming of gender norms, perceptions and culture that actually prevent access. Finally, the other one is, of course, the gender equality strategy, working for women, that actually also name the role that an inequitable education training system has to actually creating that national equality. So what's it got to do with it? Well, from a big picture perspective, quite a bit, and it's very clearly named in a number of these key documents and more. And every year the Australian government releases the status of the Women Report Card, and this year it's available on the Working for Women website. You can get a pretty big snapshot how across what I call the social determinants, that inequality that women face is prevalent and it's real and it's across all components. The care that we give, the reality and the trauma and the despair that we're all facing at the moment in the community about the prevalence of gender-based violence, the impact of health and wellbeing, the leadership of our communities, of our society, and again, economic equity. And we can see this sort of flow through the data of our own education and training system. And I think I've spoken to a few people on the line today who have seen some of these. So this is a graph, and yes, it's only up to 2020, but I have to tell you, it's not changed much. That shows just how diametrically opposed across two industries and segregated the workforce as between males and females. So you've got here one that shows the percentage of women employed and men employed in those different sectors. If we go to enrolments, this is from Victoria and it goes to 21, but it's not changed much, really. This is the enrolments in Victoria of a training package, you know, in plumbing. Females are in red, males are in blue. And it's literally the opposite if we go to another training package, right? Our education system is segregated, like our labour force. But we're also saying that you can also see that gender has got a bit to do with the experience. And if you go to even things like the main reason that people don't complete training, overwhelmingly, it is a gendered experience if you look at it. I mean, this thing here, there's a classification for called personal reasons. There's no more about what personal reasons mean. I guess they mean nothing else listed on here. And as a person that works in women's health and wellbeing, I know what those personal reasons are. They're the same things that I described in this one. A whole range of reasons. The care load I face, my economic equity, it's too expensive, the violence I'm facing, or the attitude. It'll be a whole range of those things. But overwhelmingly, women are leaving for personal reasons more than any other way. The other thing that we like to wave to remind people is that it's even gendered when it comes to capital investment. So this is from the National Skills Commission in 21. It's the unit price, right? And there's lots of criticisms of this. Oh, it's not enough data. My response there is, okay, well, get me better data and I'll have a look at it. But at the moment, that's what we've got. So if you compare the enrolments versus the unit price paid to RTOs for qualifications, overwhelmingly, the qualifications that women do, the RTOs are remunerated less, right? So, so the blue line is the enrolments and the purple line is the per unit price for the qualification. So the less women in the course, the higher the unit price. Now, that's a gender disparity. And then finally, we can see that there's gender disparity in part-time and full-time employment. Women do work more part-time than men. Question is, why not men working that as well? So these are all just evidences of just this gender disparity or gendered nature. So what's gender got to do with it in VET? Well, quite a bit. What we know from the evidence and the practice is, thanks, Danny. Thanks, Danny. Thanks for your comment. That gender inequality has an important implication. So the research overall says there's disparities in enrolment and participation, that stereotypes and biases do impact student career choices, their interests. You know, traditionally male-dominated trades like construction tend to have fewer females. We know that. We're talking about it at the moment. But the evidence is also telling us that bias actually affects the learning environment, the pedagogical moment, the educational moment, and the teaching methods in the systems, practice and policy. And that's kind of why we're here today. And a little bit more, we also know from the evidence across the globe that when we have same gender role models and mentors in non-traditional fields, right? So that's when you've got the gender, the majority, a teacher who's or a mentor who's, you know, represents the majority of the gender, it can hinder the success and retention of VET students. Many of the eventual workplaces and cultures and norms that VET students enter can involve those gender inequities. And that we've actually got, for many women globally, gaining employable vocational skills through VET can translate to greater economic empowerment, but there's so many barriers for them to get there as well. So increasing gender diversity of the instructors and training and the workforce is valuable. VET programs should aim to equip all students to identify and address these issues, and promoting gender equality and dismantling those disparities can ultimately benefit everyone. Let's apply a little bit of an intersectional eye, and then I'll come back to some deeper qualifications. If you have a particular gender, if you're in a gender minority and you carry a disability, your ability to work and learn is even more compounded, right? And the barrier is even more if your disability is profound. It compounds the oppression. So women with a disability are less likely than men in the labour force. And there's more people with a disability that are not in the labour force. We also know if we mix gender with migrant experience globally, it's really difficult. And the UN talks about the fact that this intersecting barrier of gender and migrant experience actually increases risks of exploitation or abuse of women. It's just exacerbated. And further, what we know from actually a review from the Harmony Alliance, that there is discrimination faced by women with migrant backgrounds in the humanitarian entrance and family as well. So there's really strong research about the barriers that are in place. But again, if we go more nuance and more detail on the evidence about what's gender got to do with it, globally we know the vertical and horizontal segregation is there. So it's not just siloed in different industries, it's also what we call vertical. So it's also across AQF levels, right? And here's the other thing that's worth getting your head around, and I know we've got some people from the Jobs and Skills Councils on the line today, that the evidence overwhelming is that if you have systems that have a model or a framework based on what they call skill specificity, like it's rooted in vocational competence, this actually leads to greater gendered outcomes, because what happens is you get this idea of gendered specialisation. Representation, if there's no representation and voice in the design and the program, and remember I talked about WAVE values, the centering of lived experience, yeah? So if you remove that representation, it actually removes and hinders, and the outcomes can be hindered. We know that gender and intersecting barriers can actually influence your own ability to kind of track your own career and monitor it. And there's this other really interesting thing that shows us that actually, as more students participate in vet and school systems, there is an increased level of gender-specific patterns within the vet and the education systems across that nation. Some of you kind of sitting there might be going, really? Yeah. Yeah. So it's also about what's vet got to do with it. It's actually about how the system contributes to the segregation, unless, of course, it is deliberately tackled. And finally, again, just to repeat it, from a male perspective, because when I say gender, I don't always mean women. In fact, I don't mean women, I mean gender, right? What we know is a system with a greater degree of vocational specialisation will lead to increased, or may lead to increased unemployment if males don't get the jobs that are in demand. So the specialisation limits the capacity of people who go in to get the job that they're trained for if they're not doing the job or skill for the job that's in demand. And men overwhelmingly participate in vet and in vet vocational skilling in those really specific skilling pathways than men. So it limits that transient or that transferability to other roles. So what's vet got to do with it? Quite a bit, as it turns out. And as my teenage daughter says, yeah, it's a thing. It's a thing. Right, so let's flick into the solutions game. Let's think about what those principles and those practices and the theory might be. Because as an old boss used to say to me, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Now, I think some of you might have seen this before. There's different versions of this, but really what it does is it tries to show that there are different ways that you can address gender inequality, right? And at one end, you can actually do work that knowingly or unknowingly perpetuates the inequality, yeah? It's pretty hard to kind of comprehend, or I do, that something might do that deliberately. But we can actually do work where we actually perpetuate inequality. Okay? But at the other end, we actually can do it in a way that creates equality. We can actually take deliberate planning, cautious, informed, evidence-based actions that actually changes lives. Sometimes in policy, you'll hear references to gender neutral or being gender responsive. That's actually lying in the middle here, folks. Yeah. So when we are gender neutral, really what the policy is saying is we want to acknowledge it. But what happens is nothing occurs, right? If you're gender neutral, you're not doing anything about the inequality. You're being neutral about it, right? Or you can be more specific about it. You can acknowledge it and examine it. Sometimes that might be called gender responsive as well. Where we really want to be, and I've not met an educator or a person in policy that is not doing their job for this reason. We want to be in the business of changing lives, of actually making decisions, programs, learning environments, policy settings that actually make the world a better place. And at WAVE and with many gender equity specialists around the world, that's actually called transformational gender equality, right? Just change transformational for life-changing. You're actually doing work to make a difference, not making it worse. So let's apply this idea of transformational work, life-changing work, to teaching. So if we think about the evidence and the research around gender in teaching, we know that there is gender bias in adult learning, right? We know from feedback we get from students, ethnographic, the reports that go to government, that women do face condescending attitudes and interruptions. But we also know that men can face those if they go into learning where they are the minority. There is this idea that there are learning preferences, that women may have different learning styles to men. That's often couched in terms of sociological terms. But individual differences can occur. And we also know that there are, as I've been saying before, significant participation barriers. So I talked before about capital investment. I talked about part-time work, the care burden, those participation barriers. So what we actually say, the opportunity cost, for instance, in Australia for women to go into learning is so much higher. There is a movement to what we call gender responsive pedagogy, it's called. Now, again, given what I've just said about the definitions, we would like to see that be transformational, life-changing. But it's a really good thing to understand where teaching methods actually in the classroom, the instructional methods actually challenge the gender stereotypes and deliberately look to this inclusive environment. Then you've got that idea of transformative learning. And it's sometimes called feminist pedagogy. It's not a dirty word. Where adult learners, we're really doing that transformative, life-changing work, and you're actually enabling learners to critically reflect on what they're doing in that world. And again, this kind of repeat again of the role of representation and role models. I think one of the things at the moment, while we think about the vet workforce blueprint work that's going on, and if we've got those meta pieces from our government that's saying we've put our stake in the sand, we want to create equality and gender equality. If vet's going to go, well, what's our role in this vision in the vet workforce blueprint? It's absolutely a segregated labour force. And what are we doing to change that? What are the gender action plans of that? So that's a bit of an overview of a lot of education pedagogical research, and I'm sure there's many more, but that's what caught our eye. Now, when I was growing up, and I was born in 1972, there was a show on BTV6 in rural Victoria called Blankety Blanks. It was a little bit risque, very poppy. And what they used to do, if you don't know it, is they used to put up sentences with blanks in it, right? And the celebrity stars that have to fill in the blanks. Well, I'm going to give you a bit of a blankety blank, but it's not risque. From an academic who has inspired both myself and also many others globally around this particular topic. And the quote is this: any blank blank must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot simply be stated. It has to be demonstrated through blank practices. To begin, the blank must genuinely value everyone's presence. What do you reckon the blanks are? You can stick your thoughts in the chat. Is it any productive workplace? Must insist? Has to be demonstrated through management practices? The leader? Could be that. Could it be any happy home? What else could it be? What do you think? Well, this quote is a concept called radical pedagogy. All right. And it's by a person who was developed in or written in 1994. Glued leader. Thanks, Carly. Yeah, absolutely. The full sentence is: any radical pedagogy must insist that everyone's presence is acknowledged. That insistence cannot simply be stated. It has to be demonstrated through pedagogical practice. And to begin with, the professor must genuinely value everyone's presence. I actually don't think that's radical. I actually think that that's what the educators that I know want to do. You know, that people want to do. That this idea that when we are, as Bell Hooks says, teaching to transgress or helping people be better in that transformational space, this is where it starts. And I wonder why in this world we have to write that down. Yeah, why do we have to write that down and remind ourselves that just seems good human rights to me? Well, if we think about the kind of the pedagogical model, another theory that Bell's talking to, that there's some really clear elements of it. The teaching philosophies and practices aim to create more egalitarian, empowering learning environments. And every educator I know knows that every student is different, and every student comes to their classroom or their learning environment, or the apprentice, the person in the workplace that's overseeing the apprentices, knows that every kid that rocks up, every apprentice that rocks up is so different, right? So we need to empower those people to be their best selves. So, we need to do work or set up environments that actually challenge those traditional power dynamics, because the evidence actually says that those power dynamics, if unchallenged, those traditional ones, can actually make learning environments unsafe. That's one consequence of it. Yeah. And if we actually are doing work that centres the lived experience, and I think educators try to do that, or instructional designers and assessors try to do that, they try to see, where is this student, where is this learner coming from? How do I centre their lived experience? How do we validate the journey that they've been on, rather than just abstract theories, right? This type of pedagogy actually examines and understands the intersectional barriers, the things that are preventing this person from learning, and they're participatory. So, we've all heard of participatory learning methods, or constructivist. Adults construct the meaning for themselves based on their own experience. But this sort of thing says, well, I'm here to actually help you learn, but I'm also here to help you be better in the world. I'm here to think of you as a whole person, your job and where you're going and what the environment might be. And the other thing about this particular model is it's also about the ethics of care, which is this idea of mutual understanding and empathy, which I just think also is good care. And look, this particular theory is called feminist pedagogy, and it's what bell hooks talked about. And I guess this is the model of how we can actually learn and grow and help us and our educators to address the gender inequality. But I think there might be some people on the line now going, really, Kit? In what part of the world do you think that's going to happen for an educator? And there's absolutely a legitimate question. Can our educators in our vet system do this in isolation? And the answer, of course, is possibly not, because they exist in an environment and with methodologies and systems and other pressures on them as well. And it's really hard to do this, although I go back to saying I think they want to do it. So then we go to this next stage. How do we apply this in practice? Yeah. One of the favourite quotes of all waivers, as I say, is a quote from Nelson Mandela, which I've not found anyone who doesn't agree with it, right? And one of our great members, Deb Parker, coined an article in 2020 in Training Development where she and her colleague Ellie Swindon said, if we're going to achieve equality, we actually need to model and sustain that model. And every training institution has that authority. So we're talking about the organisation the educator's in, to influence the well-being, and they're well placed to be change agents. So let's take all that theory and think, well, how do we apply that in modern pedagogy when it comes to vet? Well, the first thing we need to think about is creating what we call engaged pedagogy and a needs analysis that advances equality. And in this place, what you're really looking about is starting with the educators. I think some people have heard me say before that gender equality starts with self. You actually can't address inequality unless you've had a chance to think about your own journey and actually turn on that reticular activating system to let yourself notice it and notice it for yourself. So the first thing we do is we encourage educators to reflect on their identities, their biases, their emotional well-being, and we actually provide them with space to improve their practice. And it's that reflective practice. Now, engaged pedagogy was a term that Bell Hooks spoke to, which called educators to be critically self-reflective about their own place in the world. Now, I don't really see that competency in the Cert 4 in TAE, but, there's always tomorrow, isn't there? The other thing too is we're really emphasising in needs assessment, I guess, the idea of participatory methods. Now, if you think about how needs assessment currently goes, it's, can you do this task or can you do that job? When we do equality and when we're seeking to understand what are the barriers, the intersecting barriers that is preventing this to be achieved, what we're really understanding, yes, Danny, thank you, TAE is actually Trainers Complaints here. What we're actually talking about is a form of needs assessment that actually listens deeply to the student's experience. I've hung out with a few different people who are making their way into the world of education. And the reasons that they're in education are less to do with the job that they're in and more to do with their journey to recover from family violence or to help their single mum, or it's all about the other pieces in their life as well. And this form is called Freirean methodologies, right? Freirean methodologies, where you actually recognise the diverse needs in the classroom and contribute to curriculum. So engaged pedagogy, I'll keep going on to the next one, there's more here. But then what we do is, well, what's our curriculum design and pedagogical approaches? We're integrating those diverse perspectives into their training materials. We are creating inclusive learning environments by deliberately seeking out representation from those groups that are not in the room and implementing methods that actually get us to address and analyse the norms of gender in the room, barriers in the room, and changing them. The other approach to equity in the classroom is actually taking the space to help the learners understand how the stereotypes impact on their life. Now, a classic one for this is safety. Yeah, we think about safety in work sites. Any evidence about stereotypes and gender will tell you that the stereotypes that are asked of young men do contribute to unsafe behaviour. And it's not even work sites, it's cars. Look at the Transport Accident Commission. That's all what they do, you know, any drinking thing. Right? So this is what this comes from. And we actually need to equip those learners to help them challenge and also develop their resilience to address it in the future. And that's the transformative piece. That's where you're looking to the future. In terms of the classroom dynamics, you know, inclusive environment for all gender identities. And I know that's a journey for everyone. Open discussions, establishing rules that prevent and stop harassment and challenging traditional gender career roles when we do the career conversation. And again, the role modelling. The role modelling. You cannot be what you cannot see. When it comes to assessment, transformative practice says we will move away from actually testing methodologies that are high stakes. Yeah. Now, this is not to say not safe or not technical, because I think sometimes we do the complex equivalence. No. But something that encourages on awareness. So, you know, critical reflection even. Don't just follow the dots. Actually be self-reflective on how your vocational knowledge and your abilities work and how you can work in a way that addresses inequality. And provide feedback, which I know in a resource-constrained environment can be quite hard, but provide feedback that actually enhances that critical thinking around how can I make my workplace better? How can I work in a way that is more inclusive? Because all the evidence says that when we do that in workforces, we are more productive. This next slide I included because I know, as I said, we've got some people on this line and this call today who work in engagement and collaboration, but there is absolutely a way to do transformative work in a way that advances equality. And that's when we forge partnerships with organisations who are promoting gender equity. And WAVE is really lucky that we've been invited into conversations with some of our Skills Council friends. And we hope that that's a productive conversation, but it's that expanding of the knowledge base and the options. Let's revisit and adjust the educational strategies to align with those goals to meet the changing needs. And one of those conversations, of course, is the fact that the apprentices are no longer 16, are they? They're older people. They can't afford to live on an apprentice wage. You know, that's what that means. Adjust it to evolve with the way that the community and the people are changing. And create an environment that promotes feedback and community members. So often feedback is seen as criticism. It's about this idea of improving. And right now, some of you are going, geez, kid, that'd be nice. I'd love that. I'd love it. But, you know, what about, I don't know, a few things here. I've got a learning cabinet that's focused on competency-based training. You know, I don't develop a training package. It's out of my sight. I get the product. And there's this little thing called nominal hours. So, gee, Kit, that'd be nice. But, you know, there's a thing called industry workforce planning. And my regional variability sometimes get a look in. We have a practice in this country of an economic lens on human capacity without social context. But somehow the learner is seen as a unit in policy separate to family violence, to economic distress, to everything. And we live in this lovely jurisdictional policy environment as well. And finally, that'd be nice, but Kit, we say you can educate if you've got a Cert 4 in TAE, which, as Danny says, doesn't do all those things that you said. And the truth of the matter is, and there's no getting around it, that our system of vet in this country does put primacy on industry skills above educator skills. It does. And often the employment pathways in our education training system are casualised, ad hoc, short term. So, Kitty, that'd be nice, but what can we do? And I asked before, what can the educator do on their own? I said possibly not. And the reason of that is we actually need to lift the gaze. So we can talk about pedagogy, but that educator and assessor exists in a system of an organisation, and that organisation exists within a system of policy and national environment. And that's why gender mainstreamists and intersectional activists and workers talk about the need for systemic and structural change, because you can't do the practical if this is going to counter it. So those that have come to a previous webinar of WAVE will have seen some of these things, and these are our calls to action. And I guess hopefully you're listening to this webinar and beginning to understand why we advocate for these. So WAVE advocate that we need to develop an education system that not only anticipates current needs, but deliberately the future needs, with special attention here to women and girls, the unique needs and the barriers. But also what we're saying is it's actually anticipating that people will have different needs, that we're not one amorphous mass. You've actually got to have equity as a core principle. It's got to be fundamental to everything, not just a kind of a tick box on the end, or, you know, have we done the equity check? No, not good enough. Through everything. And you actually need to, as per this webinar, you actually need to enhance the knowledge and application of gender equality in practice, not only amongst educators and training providers, but also in the policy makers as well. We really also have this thing that we, as I said before, about centering the lived experience. If you make decisions with the same voice and the same people, you'll get the same outcome. If you don't connect with the real world, decisions about vet shouldn't be made by someone that looks at me, because my lived experience is not normal. I think many people have heard me say that before, right? You've got to centre the lived experience whose lives you want to be part of and help. Please, can we recognise that funding of vets and adult education in this country is gendered? Capital is inequitably distributed. We think all policies should have a gender impact assessments, and I know that I am in a state that has brought a bill into Parliament on Tuesday to create gender responsive budgeting as law. And I know that's unusual, so I sort of say that from a point of privilege. And we actually need to redefine what skill means. It's unassailable that those specific skill or CBT systems do actually create barriers. And we need to reframe them. And I think the work of the qualifications committee that's come out with some changes is going to be really helpful for that. As well as outcomes. Thank you, Michelle. Skill as well as outcomes. Yeah, I think, Michelle, that's part of it, isn't it? To really deeply consider the words that we use and what do we mean. So what are our recommendations? Well, given the zeitgeist given the kind of the bigger picture stuff that we're talking about. And that, you know, WAVE has sort of said, these are the things that we need to do. You know, the principles of the practice that will really create an environment, we think, where we can have gender equitable pedagogy is when the system centres lived experience. It actually does things to create gender segregated data and evidence of the impact and the planning. When we actually deliberately build capacity and capability, and we actually centre this idea of transformational intersectional equity, not gender neutral, because gender neutral is not doing anything, not doing anything. So we've had a look at that big picture of the why. I've given you a very broad brush of the practices, of the theory, as it were, and tried to apply that into what that means in the moment for that educator and that RTO and that TAFE, etc., about how they can change what they do, but completely understanding that in our vet and our education system, they can't do that alone, that actually they're in an organisation, in an industry, and in a system. So in some of the things, the calls to action that WAVE have put forward about changing that system to enable that educator to thrive. So where to next? And I think previous people will have heard these call to actions, but just a couple more. You know, our challenge is that our educators are limited in capacity, their capacity to design and deliver equitable outcomes. That, you know, you probably started to feel that when I started to talk about, you know, the ideal world. And we think the thing to do is to actually flip it. Let's actually put on parity or put a primacy on the skill of education and reform the professional pathways that lead to them. As someone that used to work in vet a long time ago, some of the most awkward questions I had was when I had a PhD and a master in education, I had to say to them, no, you need to get your Cert 4 NTAE. And we need to address these systemic barriers that prevent educators from doing that work, from implementing the learning that we need to get more people on the job in a sustainable way. One of the other challenges is this idea of vet canon and the bodies of knowledge stop at gender equality. So we're asking the solution here. Michelle. Yep, I'll come back to that in a second. I'll just finish this one. That's a great question. I don't know if someone else can see the question there from Michelle, but if you've got some responses, feel free to share. I think being intersectional and transformative practice and research is going to, with vet canon, with vet research, is going to be a real bonus. So Michelle has asked, where do you see the role of industry and employer here? How to bring a feminist pedagogical practice into workplace training? For mine, Michelle, and welcome any comments and feedback that anyone might car. It's here, right? So the organisations that do really well in this space where they actually address equity, you can see the way that they centre the lived experience of their consumers, of their workers. You can see that they absolutely understand that they don't know everything. And I think the same thing is it needs to occur in the advisory mechanisms, or what WAVE would see, the same thing needs to occur in the national advisory mechanism. So WAVE are on record putting in submissions that actually say we need to rethink what we mean by tripartite, which I do understand is a courageous career move. But we need to think about what we mean by tripartite. Are the voices around the table the ones whose lives we are seeking to transform? All of them. And that's just not about ticking a list, it's about the processes and the systems we learn to do that as well. So Michelle, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a thought, but we're really happy at WAVE to continue this conversation absolutely with you. But I think it's a very powerful question that you asked, and I think kind of at the heart of some of the challenges we face as well. And this goes also, Michelle, to our next challenge. Our experience is that industry advisory structures in all their forms, and it's not just the JCs, because every state's got one, and there's ones that are everywhere. Advisory committees everywhere, right? This is not about the JCs at all, not about them. When we think of advisory structures, Our experience is that they know there's a problem, but they're not sure what to do, right? This is this idea of capacity and capability building, not bringing someone in to write a report to fix it and leaving again, but actually in there building the skills, knowledge of the people who are doing the work so that they can sustainably continue to do it, right? Not writing a report and letting it be on a table. Because you can write a report with recommendations, but then you've got to know how to implement them. Other call to action and challenge is we see that the equity conversations at the moment are located in different spaces. Every piece of practice across the world says you need to bring them together in a coordinated and, importantly, collaborative approach. Because then what you do is you leverage energy and, importantly, dollars. $1 doesn't need to go there or there. You bring them together and you make it more powerful. And finally, the challenge is, you know, if we have those same voices, it will result in different same outcomes. Again, we say it again, we need to bring lived experience into the room. So what can you do as participants? Well, you know, we're asking for common approaches to the messages about equity's role and space in vet and adult education policy. And the best thing that anyone can do is raise their voice about it. The more people we have asking questions about equity, about feeling their interest in connecting to the topic of their interest in it, we just know that's better. And as someone that works in community to prevent gender-based violence, I can tell you hands down, that is a very powerful thing to do. So colleagues, that's sort of bringing us to the end of our session. I'm really happy to take any comments, questions or queries that anyone may have as well. Our next webinar will actually be on with the team at SAGE. So they have the Athena Swan framework for reducing inequity in science and technology, particularly in higher education. But we're going to do a particular webinar with them about applying a gender lens to the work in that particular cohort as well. So stay tuned for that. We'll certainly send it. But offer the opportunity of any questions or queries. But of course, if you've got to go, please take 10 minutes of your day back. I do know how busy you all are as well. We will record this webinar, we're recording it, and we'll be absolutely sending it out to you. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Seems like everyone wants to go, and look forward to hanging out with you again very soon. Bye-bye.